throughout the 90s and early 2000s. It seemed like every April, or I know in every April, I heard about this woman wheelchair racing that won the Boston Marathon. I was so proud to hear that because I was a University of Illinois graduate. So that was exciting. So I tried to find her here at the U of I. I knew she worked here, and I did track her down. And just a little bit about her here. First of all, she was born in Milwaukee with a condition that did not allow her to walk. She became involved in participating in wheelchair basketball in high school and was recruited to the U of I as a wheelchair basketball player. She also got involved in wheelchair racing, and as a racer, she began competing in events that eventually led her to racing in the Boston Marathon, beginning in 1990. She went on to win 8 times in Boston, the most times of any other female athlete in any division. She also competed in the Paralympics in 98, 92, 96, and 2000, winning several medals in different races. She was inducted in the U.S. Olympic Hall of Fame in 2012. Jean is a motivational speaker, author, advocate worldwide for persons with disabilities. She has served as a corporate spokesperson for Ocean Spray, United Airlines, and she's been featured on Good Morning America and Today's Show, ABC Nightline, and ESPN. She's also very active as a global advocate for people with disabilities. She has traveled to Ghana in West Africa several times to teach athletes and coaches about the sport of wheelchair track. And she also teamed up with several Champaign, Illinois area Rotary clubs and Rotary International to bring athletes and coaches from Ghana to the U.S. I think that's what I've got. So Jean, you can correct anything I've already said or just add to it. We look forward to hearing from you. Great.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks, everybody. I have to say this is the first time I've done a virtual Rotary meeting. There's a first time for everything. But I've done a lot of Zoom meetings. I'm curious, by show of hands, how many of you have heard me speak before? A couple of you. I just moved back to Champaign. I was living in Raleigh, North Carolina the last couple of years, working at North Carolina State University. But I've spent many, many years living in Champaign-Urbana. This is an amazing community, and I am incredibly proud that my racing career was here. My last event was at the Sydney Games in 2000. I've been retired from racing almost 20 years, but it seems like it's been 3 or 4 or 5. It doesn't seem that long. I grew up in Milwaukee. I'm one of 5 kids. As Bob's intro mentioned, I was born with spina bifida. I was born in the mid-60s at a time where nearly half the babies born with spina bifida died because of infection or other complications related to the disability. Spina bifida is an open spine, and during the first couple of weeks I was growing inside my mom, my spine didn't close properly, and because my spine didn't close properly, my spinal cord had some damage. And when you have damage to your spinal cord, the closer you get to the brainstem, the less physical function you have. The lower on your spinal cord you have damage, the more physical function you retain. So when I was born, the damage to my spine was relatively low. It was in the lumbar region. And so I was able to walk as a child with below the knee braces. And when I was 9, I learned to ride a 2-wheel bike. It's a few years later than most kids without a disability, but I was extremely proud of that. Gave me a newfound independence I didn't know. Because of the spina bifida, I couldn't even walk 1 block to school, much less do racing of any type. So my career has really been an incredible surprise. When I was a freshman in high school, I had a bike accident. I was coming home from a babysitting job and I took a corner too sharply and I dislocated my hip. And the reason my hip dislocated so easily was because of the weak muscle in my lower body due to the spina bifida. Over the next year, I had 5 major hip operations and spent that year in a body cast. Body cast went from just below my chest all the way down my body. And when I wasn't in the hospital having surgery, I was in a hospital bed in the middle of our living room at home. I would go back into Milwaukee Children's Hospital every 8 weeks or so for another surgery in this series of operations. I could not have imagined what would come after laying in a body cast. Last week, I had an opportunity to speak to the women's volleyball team at North Carolina State University. Some of them are really having a hard time right now with the restrictions, not being able to train, not being able to compete, not being able to have a spring and summer season to get them ready for their fall season. I'm sure our Illini girls are feeling some similar things, but I was able to share that I was far more confined in that body cast than we are in the shelter in place order. And there were great things to come. And so we just have to put our hope in the great things to come after all of this. Well, I got my last body cast off and I thought I was going to be better than ever, more functional than before. I really didn't understand my disability. And I went to see the doctor after being at home for a couple of weeks. And he said, "We're sorry, none of the surgeries worked. Just from sitting up in bed, trying to get flexible, your hip is dislocating again. You just don't have enough muscle in your lower body. So you're gonna have to start using crutches and a wheelchair." And I was devastated because the doctor, the orthopedic doctor who had been taking care of me was the team doctor for the Milwaukee Bucks NBA team. And I thought, why can he fix everybody else and he can't fix me? I was really angry about the wheelchair and I wouldn't touch the crutches for the first couple weeks. We had an office chair at home and I was pushing off my mother's walls in order to get around. I'm sure she didn't like my hands all over the walls. I say my mother's walls because she's the one who cleaned them. My dad did not. Anyway, I had been attending an all-girls college prep high school. When I had my bike accident, it was November of my freshman year of high school. And when I went back to school, it was second semester sophomore year. I had an in-home tutor who was coming to teach me, but she was from the Milwaukee public school system. And I was not kept on pace with my peers at the college prep school. So when I got back to school, I was lost. I was behind in everything. English was always a strength of mine. And I remember the teacher was talking about iambic pentameters. I had no clue what that was. Sounded like a foreign language to me. To this day, I know it's meter in poetry, but I don't know much more than that. Ultimately, I transferred to a public school, a public high school for my junior and senior year so that I could graduate on time. If I had stayed at the private school, they required 8 more credit hours to graduate than the public school, and that would have meant a whole extra year of school. But I was born 12 months behind my sister, and inside I thought I was born a year behind my sister, I'm graduating a year behind my sister. If I go to this public school, I can take a full load my junior and senior year. Other kids were out on work study, but I could graduate on time. During my first couple of weeks at this new high school, there was also another kid who had spina bifida, used a wheelchair, and came up to me and said, "Hey, have you ever heard of wheelchair soccer?" It's like, "Wheelchair soccer? How do you play wheelchair soccer? You need your legs to play soccer." He's like, "Oh, it's this really cool adapted sport." I heard that word adapted and I thought, no way. It is hokey. It is stupid. It isn't sport. I'm not going to go hang out with those other wheelchair people. They're weird. I can get up on crutches. That guy kept asking and asking and asking and asking. And finally, by May of my junior year, I thought the only way I'm going to get this guy off my back is to go to this practice. So I went to the practice knowing I wasn't going to like it. And much to my surprise, chairs are crashing and banging, bodies are flying. And I thought, this is sport. This is real sport. So I kept going back. And after wheelchair soccer, I found out about wheelchair football, wheelchair ice hockey, wheelchair basketball, softball, tennis. You can even do wheelchair square dancing. And when you swing your partner, you get good speed going up. It is a blast. Ultimately, I was recruited to the University of Illinois to play wheelchair basketball. I had started college up in Milwaukee. I was at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And the wheelchair basketball coach at Illinois came up to Milwaukee to teach a weekend wheelchair sports workshop. And he saw me playing an exhibition game of wheelchair soccer and came up to me and gave me his pitch. How would you like to become a member of the University of Illinois women's wheelchair basketball team? Well, most of us know that Wisconsinites and Illinoisans don't really like each other. And I grew up at a time where we didn't really know there was a downstate Illinois. Illinois was Chicago. And our radio DJs were criticizing theirs and vice versa. And there is no way this cheesehead was going down to Illinois. But the coach kept calling and sending letters and calling and sending letters. And it struck me, somebody wanted me on their team. And that meant a lot to me. It wasn't a monetary scholarship at that time in the late 80s, but somebody wanted me on their team. I was the kid who was picked last at recess for physical education classes. And this guy really, really was working to get me down there. So I thought, I'll go down to Illinois. I'll be down there 3 or 4 years, whatever it takes to finish my education. And then I'm hightailing it back to Milwaukee. So I came down to Champaign, and not only did I play basketball, but I also got involved in their track and road racing program. And for the first 2 years, my racing coach was trying to talk me into doing a marathon, the full 26.2 mile race. Now, I have wondered this, who wants to do a marathon? There are folks, I was not one of those people who wanted to do a marathon. And it took my coach 2 years to talk me into trying a marathon. I did a half marathon trying to appease him. My favorite distance was a 10K. I love the 10K, the 6.2 mile race, but he wanted me to do a marathon. And so finally in 1989, to get my coach off my back, just like that kid in high school, I told my coach, Marty Morse, okay, I'll do one marathon and that is it. So I started training for the Chicago Marathon. And all of a sudden, workouts were twice as long. I was out on the roads twice as long. I was twice as tired afterward. And have any of you ever been chased by farm dogs? In those racing chairs, which are low to the ground, we are at teeth level. You get the full effect of those dogs. And it was scary. I hated them. But I learned where the farm dogs were. It always seemed like they would jump out right after we'd finish an interval. You know, we'd go hard for a minute or go hard for 2 minutes, and then you're supposed to have rest recovery time. And those darn farm dogs would come right after you finished the interval. So you kept going hard to get away from that dog. Ultimately, I got ready for the Chicago Marathon. It was October of '89. I couldn't wait to get the marathon over. I did not like the extra training. The night before the race, I was so nervous. I couldn't sleep. I didn't think I belonged in the race and I wasn't going to finish. And, you know, if farm dogs were scary, Chicago style dogs were probably scarier. And I had Doberman pinschers in my mind. I grew up in Milwaukee. I grew up in a city, and the city is smaller than Chicago. And I wondered what happens if I get lost. Suddenly the race is longer than 26.2 miles and you don't know how long it is until you get back on track. So I was really nervous. But sitting on the starting line, my goal was to stay with my teammate Ann as long as possible. She had been killing me in workouts, but my goal was to focus on her. Amazingly, I stayed with her for the first 20 miles and only had to do the last 6.2 miles alone. Eventually, I finished the race. My coach, Marty, came up to me and said, "Jean, do you realize what you just did?" I said, "Marty, you were right. I finished the race. I did a marathon." He said, "And you qualified for Boston." My heart sunk. I did not want to do another marathon. He said, "You finished 8 seconds under 2 hours." I said, "Marty, I am never doing another marathon." My hands were bloody. I had bled through my gloves. My body was as sore as it's ever been. I was not doing another marathon. And he said, "Jean, people dream about qualifying for Boston. You can't qualify for Boston and not do it." So when Coach Strawling suggests something, you end up going along with it. And the following spring, it's my senior year at the U of I, I'm sitting on the start line of the Boston Marathon thinking, well, actually, I wasn't thinking. I was yelling at my coach under my breath. "I don't belong in this race. We don't have hills like this in Champaign." I mean, the Boston Marathon has Heartbreak Hill, and Champaign-Urbana has the I-57 overpass, the I-74 overpass, and those are about the only named hills in this area. So I did not think I was going to make it. And then I turned my focus to my teammate and some of the other people in the field. It was an international field. I knew some of them. I didn't know all of them. And I thought, I'm going to try to finish top 3. That's my goal. I finished top 3 at Chicago. I'm going to try to do that here at Boston. So the race started, and within the first 7 miles or so, I was in the top 3. Well, my teammate Ann sprinted away, but now I'm vying for second place with a gal from Denmark. And at mile 17, I outclimbed the gal from Denmark, and at mile 20, I caught up to my teammate Ann. Now, I didn't realize that I was in the middle of Heartbreak Hill at mile 20. Heartbreak Hill is a series of hills, miles 19 to 21. And I caught up to Ann and then outclimbed her in the hills. And I looked at my little cycle computer, which tells me miles per hour, average speed, max speed, time, distance. And I figured out that I was under world record pace. And the world record pace was the gal from Denmark that I outclimbed at mile 17. So I had a new boost of energy. And I kept checking my speed and my time at mile 23, mile 24, mile 25, mile 26. And when I came across the finish line, not only did I win my first Boston Marathon, but I broke the world record by almost 7 minutes. At 26.2 miles earlier, I didn't think I belonged in the race. And the cool thing is, wheelchair racing isn't under the NC2A guidelines. There aren't enough universities and colleges that have wheelchair sports programs. So we don't abide by the guidelines, but we don't get any support from them either. So because I broke the course record and the world record at the Boston Marathon, I won $25,000. As a senior in college, that is a boatload of money. And I wasn't mad at my coach anymore, I'll tell you that. I bought my first brand new vehicle with that money. I was driving a junker, as most college kids do. And I felt great. The next year I went back to Boston, I won and broke the world record again. The next year I went back to Boston, I won and broke the world record again. The first 5 years I went out there, I won and broke the world record. The first 7 years I went out there, I won consecutively. Nobody had done that in the history of the race. Then the next year, when I was going to break the record of most wins, I crashed. My wheel got caught in a trolley track. I still finished second, but I didn't win. The next year, I went back to Boston. I got out sprinted at the finish line and lost by 0.2 of a second. In '99, I went back to Boston, pursuing that elusive 8th win, and I got out sprinted at the finish line by 0.5 seconds. So it's 2000. It's my last race. I knew I was retiring after the 2000 season, and everybody had written me off now. The gal from Australia, my main rival, Louise Savage, had beaten me in 97, 98, 99. I was past my prime. But one of the beauties of being an underdog is the pressure is different. It's not there like it is when you're the favorite. So I came into the race not as the favorite and ultimately won my 8th Boston Marathon. I'm the first person to ever win 8 Boston Marathons, and I beat Louise by about 25 seconds. That felt awesome. I went through the rest of my season that year, and my last marathon was during the Sydney Games in 2000, and I won the gold medal. I got the last gold medal given in Sydney before the closing ceremonies. It just was a fairy tale career, fairy tale ending. And when I finished, I thought, what am I going to do now? So I did full-time motivational speaking for 3.5 years and got really road weary, got tired of talking about myself. And so I was looking for, quote unquote, a real job. And I ended up moving to Indianapolis and working in a chiropractor's office. Well, I was making about 1/3 what I was as a professional athlete. And the University of Illinois reached out to me and asked if I would consider taking this applying for a brand new fundraising position in the College of Applied Health Sciences. And at first I thought, fundraising, no way. But about 6 weeks later, I thought, I won't have to pay for my own insurance, and I'll get a more decent salary. I think I'm going to apply for this. And ultimately, I was offered the job, and I came back to Champaign and started my career in development and fundraising February 27th, 2006. I was contacted in 2003 by an organization called Johnny and Friends. Have any of you ever heard of Johnny Erickson Tata? Not really. Johnny Erickson Tata has a huge Christian ministry called Johnny and Friends. She is a woman who broke her neck in 1967 diving into a shallow lake in Maryland. And after she broke her neck, she was paralyzed pretty much from the neck down. She had a little bit of movement in her arms, but she wore braces on her arms, didn't have any movement in her fingers, and all she wanted to do was die. She couldn't imagine going through life as a quadriplegic. She worked her way through that depression, and several years later founded an organization called Johnny and Friends. She is a prolific painter. She holds a paintbrush in her mouth and paints some of the most beautiful images that you could imagine. And she has a beautiful singing voice. She's a recording artist. And she was the guest chaplain during the 2000 Sydney Paralympic Games. And when I wasn't competing, I went to her Bible studies. And we both knew about one another, but we hadn't met until we got to Sydney. Well, I had shared with her that I was going to be retiring after the 2000 Games. And so one of her staff members reached out to me in March of 2003 and asked if I would be willing to go to Ghana, West Africa to teach a wheelchair track camp. Actually, no, it was 2001. It was right after I retired. And I said, I'm not interested in going to Africa. I mean, I saw all the specials. I knew the poverty. I saw that people are starving. And I thought, somebody using a wheelchair, it is not going to be accessible. And I'm not interested. So they called back a second time. I think it was in May of 2001. And I turned them down a second time. And they called back a third time. And I finally said, okay, I have this pattern in my life. If you pester me enough, usually I come around. And so just like that kid in high school, just like my coach wanting me to do the marathon, I agreed to go to Ghana and West Africa. So I was there in August of 2001. It was late August, early 2000. And I knew that polio was still endemic. I was expecting people maybe to limp into the stadium or to walk on crutches, but I was completely unprepared for the people who crawled into the stadium on their hands and knees. They had sandals on their hands and they had calluses on their knees like you have on the bottom of your feet. There aren't wheelchairs in a lot of those developing nations. There isn't a wheelchair manufacturer on the entire continent of Africa. They repurpose chairs. I've seen lawn chairs with chairs put on them. But organizations, Johnny and her organization were the first ones in 1994 to go to Ghana and bring donated wheelchairs. They collect wheelchairs across the US, send them to one of 20 prisons where inmates restore them to like new condition, and then they're distributed in countries like Ghana, Vietnam, Romania, places where wheelchairs are scarce commodities. So it's called Wheels for the World. It's a program within Johnny and Friends. And Johnny had asked me to join a Wheels for the World trip, but to teach a wheelchair track camp. So I had 7 somewhat antiquated racing chairs that I had brought with me. 6 were functional. And so there were 32 folks with disabilities who showed up for this wheelchair track camp. And they all had to share the equipment. And for some of them, for 10 minutes in the morning and 10 minutes in the evening, it was the only time during the day that they were up off the ground. That really hit my heart. And I thought, you know, when I first got my wheelchair, I didn't want to touch it. And yet I've never had the indignity of having to crawl on the ground. I've always had a wheelchair when I've needed it. And so my personal mission became to help get people up off the ground, literally and figuratively. I went back in 2002. Nobody had to talk me into it. And actually, in 2001, I was there during 9/11. We were hosting a track meet. It was the last day of our wheelchair track camp in this small town called Kumasi. And the mayor of the town came in and said, America's under attack. We're stunned. But we completed the track meet so that the athletes could get their full experience. And then we rushed back to our hotel, turned on BBC, and saw the same footage that all of you saw on your TVs. And it was quite striking. We were supposed to go home like 3 days later, and then we were told we were going to be there 5 more weeks. I don't know if any of you have been in developing nations, but I will admit to you, I am a spoiled American, and after 2.5 weeks, I was so ready to come home. The thought of being there for 5 more weeks was truly distressing. And so we were, the Johnny and Friends staff members were checking in with the embassy several times a day. And meanwhile, I was on TV programs doing interviews about the wheelchair sports camp. And I went on one show that was called Grace, and it was modeled after the Oprah Winfrey show. I went into the studio, and there were 5 rows of plastic lawn chairs, 2 deep. That was the studio audience. And they clipped on my microphone with a paper clip, and we went ahead and did the interview. It was a very unique experience. Eventually, we were only there an extra 5 days. It wasn't an extra 5 weeks, and I have never been so grateful to be able to come home. But as I mentioned, in 2002, I went back and didn't have to get talked into it. 2003, I got an idea. I had spoken to the Savoy Rotary Club and asked if they would help me raise money to bring some of those wheelchair athletes from Ghana here to America so that we could get them their very own everyday wheelchairs and their very own racing chairs. And then we partnered with 5 local Rotary clubs and the Rotary Club in the capital city of Ghana, which is Accra. And we raised $30,000. Lynette Marshall, who was part of the Savoy Rotary Club, wrote a grant to Rotary International, and they doubled our money. So we had $60,000, and we brought 8 wheelchair athletes from Ghana to the US. For most of them, with the exception of one, none of them had been on an airplane before. They would marvel at the planes flying over them when they were home, but they'd never been on an airplane before. And we also brought 2 able-bodied coaches so that they could learn what we were doing as well. It took them a while to get visas, and so they weren't able to fly into Atlanta, where the wheelchair manufacturer is located. They flew into Baltimore, Maryland. And so I rented a 15-passenger van, outfitted it with portable hand controls. One of the Rotarians lent me a trailer that we hooked on the back, and all by myself, I drove from Champaign to Baltimore, Maryland, towing that trailer. And I picked up the wheelchair athletes, and their baggage and their crutches, and we drove down to Atlanta. We stopped in Washington, D.C., because it's such a landmark. It's known around the world. And so they just wanted to walk around the White House and take pictures. And I told them I couldn't park in the Circle Drive outside the White House. So they had to come right back. 20 minutes later, the security guards come up to me and say, "You can't park here." And I said, "Well, I don't know where they went. These are first-time visitors from Ghana, West Africa. You saw them crawl out of the van." He said, "I know, you're really not supposed to be here." 30 minutes later, they come back. They said, "Oh," I said, "Where have you guys been?" They said, "Oh, well, we joined a tour. We took a tour of the White House." Fortunately, the security guards let me stay in that Circle Drive, and they all loaded back up, and we drove down to Atlanta, and all the athletes got measured for custom-made everyday chairs and racing chairs. And then I drove them here to Champaign while the chairs were being built. They were here for a week, and we had extra equipment for them in which they could train. They went and did wheelchair basketball, and they were on the track in borrowed racing chairs, and they were doing weight workouts. My coach and my teammates, everybody chipped in. Everybody was helping give them the experience of their lives. A week later, the chairs were done, and a couple of folks from the Savoy Rotary Club drove down to Atlanta and picked up the everyday wheelchairs and the racing chairs, drove them back here. And when the wheelchair athletes got them, when the wheelchair athletes got them, we were at a luncheon for the Savoy Rotary Club. But really, all of the Rotary clubs got to meet the Ghanaian athletes and hear from the ones who spoke English. There was one young man who was the only male in his family, and he got polio when he was very young. But because he was the only male, he was allowed to go to school. The young ladies, once they got polio, one young lady got polio in 4th grade, and it was deemed her life was over. In Ghana, if you have a disability, you are less than a 3rd-class citizen. It's deemed you're cursed by God, and you have no value, no future. But when they came here to the US, they were treated like kings and queens. Joe White was the president of the University of Illinois at the time, and he invited them into his office and served lunch in his office. It was so amazing. So when these folks got their first wheelchairs, Raphael, the young man who could speak English, sat down in the chair and he said, "I'm so happy I could laugh." Isn't that great imagery? I've always remembered that. And so in 2005, the wheelchair athletes, we raised money again and brought them back here. The cool thing is, after their trip to the US in 2003, the next year, 2004, was an Olympic and Paralympic year in Athens. And for the first time in history, one male and one female from Ghana represented their country at the Paralympic Games. They had their country's flag in the opening ceremonies. I'm getting chills talking about it because it was so monumental. And Raphael has become a leader for all people with disabilities in that country. He is a spokesperson. He is critical of their government. He has fought. He has found corporate sponsors for himself. He has gotten new folks into wheelchair racing. I'm just so intensely proud of him. one of the cool things that have come out of that is two of the folks that I met in Ghana, one coach and one athlete, have had children since we met. And the coach actually has had two children. And typically it's custom in Ghana for the grandmother to name the baby. But the coach asked me to name the first child and then the second child. And then one of the athletes asked me to name her child. I don't have any children. So that was such a special experience. It still is. And I'm still in touch with those folks. And seeing Isaac and Joseph and Daniel running around in pictures really fills up my heart. So I have such a strong appreciation and friendship with Champaign-Urbana Rotary clubs, and I appreciate your interest in having me speak to you this morning. Like you, I'm a morning person, so this is a great time of day. Does anybody have any questions for me?
That is great, Jean. Thank you. Any questions?
Anybody?
Yeah, I've got one. So in your training regimen, especially getting ready for these marathons, did you train every day, and was it several hours a day? How did that go?
Yeah, great question. I trained 6 to 7 days a week, 3 to 5 hours a day. Most days were two a day workouts. Every once in a while, it was a 3 workout day. We lifted weights 3 to 4 times a week, and our mileage was anywhere from 120 to 150 miles a week. Some of that was out on the road, some of that was on the track. One of my points of pride, when I first started training after coming to the University of Illinois, I lost a lot of weight and I got really strong. I already was strong from walking on crutches. Any of you who have walked on crutches know that it is natural strength building. But I went home for Christmas, and my brothers, who are 18 months younger than me, they're twins, saw how strong I had gotten, and they started setting up arm wrestling competitions with their friends. And I did 1 or 2 of them, and their friends were cheating because they couldn't lose to a girl. And so I stopped doing the arm wrestling competitions. But my max bench press was 210 pounds.
Whoa!
I had a body weight of 112 pounds. And because I didn't have lower body strength to stabilize myself with my legs, I would strap to the bench. And so I got 210 up. I didn't do twice my body weight because I didn't want to lose the flexibility I needed to push my racing chair. But I like telling that figure because it helps give people an idea that this wasn't recreation. This was hardcore training.
That's hardcore.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary. What about your diet?
Well, back in the day, I was blissfully eating carbohydrates and protein and vegetables. And I think one of the hardest things to transition after I retired from racing was my diet, because I learned really quickly I wasn't burning off all those carbs anymore, and so I couldn't eat all those carbs. I still eat them as a treat every once in a while, but these days mostly it's protein and vegetables. But it was a typical athlete's diet, and man, I believe I had the best coach in the world. I loved training. I loved going in every day. I had this fire inside that just made me want to get stronger and faster and work hard every day. And when I started losing that fire in 98, 99, 2000, I knew it was time to start thinking about retiring from racing. I think one of the gifts an athlete has is to retire on their own terms instead of because of injury or other circumstance like not being able to afford entry fees or getting to competitions. I had sponsorships. As Bob mentioned, I had Ocean Spray, which was based in the Boston area in Plymouth. I had United Airlines based in Chicago. I had Lighthouse Foods. They make salad dressings, dips, and marinades. I was able to afford it. And I had an equipment sponsor. Eagle Sports Chairs made every chair. I got a new everyday chair every year and a new racing chair every year. I was well taken care of. But a lot of people aren't. And so for that reason, they're not able to compete. But I will tell you, even though it was my choice to retire from racing, there was about a 10-year transition. I understand why it's really hard for professional athletes who are in the public eye to retire, or even Olympic athletes. And sometimes they go past their prime because there is a structure in place. You know where you're going to be when you're training. You know where you're going to be every weekend for competition. And it's, you know, like the military, there is a structure and there is stability in that. And when people get out of the military and when people are post-racing career, that structure is gone. And unless you create your own structure, it's really challenging. So it was a 10-year transition for me, trying to figure out how much I was going to work out and not. And I'll tell you, there's a difference between training and working out. Right now, I just work out. I'm not training.
So, what kind of things do you do in your working out now?
Well, have you guys ever seen a hand cycle? Do you know what a hand cycle is?
Yeah.
They're different from the racing chairs. The racing chairs look like drag racers. There's one wheel in the front, two wheels in the back. They're cambered to provide more stability on the base so that when we're going around corners at 19, 20 miles an hour, we don't go up on two wheels and over. A hand cycle is geared. It's like a bike, only you crank it with your hands. A racing chair has no gears. You are punching the push rim in a very efficient manner. You're not grabbing the push rim. Essentially, you're fanning it. But there are gloves that allow you to just punch it. And it's similar to when you were a kid and you turned your bike on its handlebars and you would fan that wheel to try to get it going as fast as you can. A hand cycle is geared and you crank it with your arms. I had a hand cycle that I was using to work out, but it got old and I kept having to repair it. And so I thought, I'll get a new hand cycle and I will donate my hand cycle to an adapted sports program for kids. So I donated the hand cycle and then started looking into getting a new hand cycle, and they are expensive. $6,000, $8,000, $10,000. And I can't get a bottom line $3,000 one that's a tank. I need something that's going to be lighter weight. I'm a spoiled former athlete. So I haven't replaced my hand cycle yet, but I will eventually. Right now, I just get out on the bike paths around Champaign Urbana and pushing my everyday chair. And I've got weights that I work with on my rotator cuff muscles, shoulder muscles. I do rotator cuff lifts to keep my shoulders strong. My friends describe me as being fiercely independent, and that is a good description. I cherish my independence, and my shoulders are a huge part of that, so I take care of them. I also do some back lifts, some back flies to keep my upper back strong. When somebody is pushing in a wheelchair, they're using all their anterior muscles, the muscles in the front of their body. They're not using back muscles. And so I am intentional to do exercises where I'm pulling backwards on the chair using my back muscles, but also doing those lighter weight lifts to strengthen my back to make sure that it stays strong and that there's some muscular balance. Usually injuries come when there's an imbalance, and I'm trying to prevent that.
How fortunate that you landed at the University of Illinois with a legacy of activists to aid people with disabilities.
I'm having a real hard time hearing
Yeah,
you.
yeah,
Yeah.
me too.
Me too.
I'm sorry, Jean.
He's at the beach.
How fortunate of you to land at the University of Illinois with a legacy of actions to aid people with disabilities. Yeah. I'm sorry.
I am so sorry. I still am not making
Yeah.
out. I heard the first part. Can do you know how to type in comments? Can you ask your question by typing it into the comment section? There's a chat. If you push chat, you can type it.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Gene, do you spend much time around the current U of I athletes and challenge each other in races and challenge each other?
I don't spend a lot of time around the current athletes. The coach, the head coach, is a former teammate of mine, and we're still good friends. And Maureen Gilbert, who essentially manages all of their operations, she would be the equivalent of an athletic director and so much more. I'm still very close to her, but I have tried to minimize my shadow so that other athletes have an opportunity to have their own glory. And so after I retired, I was intentional about stepping back and allowing the up and coming athletes to have their time in the sun. And so I follow their success. I still go to the wheelchair basketball tournaments when they're in town, but my own work schedule keeps me super busy, and so I don't have time to run over there most days.
When you have let's say a competitive wise, very good racing wheelchair, what kind of cost is involved with a wheelchair of that caliber?
That's a great question, because if any of you are familiar with cycling, you know that the better the wheel you get, the more you pay. The better the material you have for the frame, the more you pay. And so the same is true in wheelchair racing. You can get an aluminum frame and carbon fiber wheels, and that'll set you back about $3,500. You can get a titanium frame. You can get a carbon fiber custom made frame molded around you. And those are a lot more expensive. The carbon fiber wheels, we use the same wheel technology as cyclists do. And the sports chair manufacturers switch out the hub so that there's an axle that is threaded and screws into the racing frame. But you can get as good a technology and wheels as exists.
I bet.
And that part of it is really fun.
Yeah, I bet.
Gene, I got Scott on chat here. I think his
Sure.
comment was, Illinois has such a great history of actions to aid people with disabilities. How fortunate you landed here and have added to that legacy. Or of a comment. Gina, I'm going to kind of wrap things up here a little bit. I want to say thank you. I was photo editor for the News Gazette I got here about the same time you did, and I enjoyed taking your picture.
Oh, I recognize you. I know who you are.
All right. Anyway, thank you. And when things clear out a little bit, we give books to Head Start in name of our speakers. So we'll do that. And thank you. I didn't realize how much Rotary had helped you with the projects, and we're still here.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank
Oh,
you.
wonderful.
And I just want to say, I am deeply, deeply ingratiated to the University of Illinois and how I just accidentally fell into being here. I didn't know anything about its history, and I can't give a speech without talking about them. But I also want to say thank you to all of you. The impact that Rotary has in this community is immeasurable. and I appreciate your commitment to service. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. And now we when we get there together, we sing to close the meeting. But so singing together on Zoom is kind of
It doesn't work.
doesn't work.
It
I
doesn't
sang
work
happy
when we're
birthday last
together
week.
either.
It doesn't work.
Carrie, who preceded me as president, usually has a little story for us to help us take us out for the week.
Oh,
Okay.
story, such pressure. I'm sure all of you those of you who work from home and such are dealing more and more with email. But my day is consumed with it working from home. And I have to warn you, if you get an email from Hormel, do not answer, do not open it. All it is spam.
Oh, God.
I hate to do that, but on that note, have a great week, Sunrisers.